good afternoon, and thank you so much, or good evening, good morning, wherever you are. I hope you're having a good evening or day. Welcome to our audience, and a very special welcome back to Dennis Ross, who is well known to this audience and of course far beyond. Tonight's topic is of keen interest to our audience as we all try to understand what's happening with Israel, its leadership, and its politics. Of course, welcome to our super moderator, Warren Olney. We are sorry that Yedidia Stern cannot be with us tonight, but he has agreed to join us on a future program, and we'll look forward to that. America at a Crossroads is a joint venture between Jews United for Democracy and Justice and Community Advocates, Inc. Thanks, as always, to our leadership team, especially to former Congressman Mel Levin and to Zev Yaroslavsky, a very prominent local leader for the last many decades. Next week, former U.S. Ambassador to Russia, Michael McFaul, will join us to bring us up to date on the Russia-Ukraine war and to share with us his perspective on Putin's near and longer term future. He will be in conversation with the great Larry Mantle. The following week, on February 1st, one of the most distinguished journalists, analysts, and authors covering foreign affairs with an emphasis on Iran and the Middle East, Robin Wright, will be with us. Robin has covered wars, revolutions, and uprisings around the world and has reported from more than 140 countries. She writes for The New Yorker. She's a fellow with the U.S. Institute of Peace and the Woodrow Wilson Center, and has written 5 books and co-authored 3 others, mostly on the topic of uprisings and focusing a lot on the Middle East. Her most recent work and articles relate to the uprising in Iran, and we'll be very interested in hearing her perspective and analysis. Remember, if you need to, please turn up the volume. We have live captioning. And because I get literally hundreds of emails from people each week who claim they're not getting the link, it's either because you checked a box when you registered, or you unchecked a box. Don't uncheck any boxes when you register if you want to get the Zoom link, or you need to re-register for our email list. So I'm happy to provide that to you, but it's a lot easier if we can figure out why you're not receiving it, because we send it out about 5 times in the 24 hours before the program, and it's easier if most of you can receive it by email. Meanwhile, I know you're all doing your best to do that. So now I'd like to, of course, welcome my friend and colleague, David Laird. David?
Thank you, Janice. Good evening. Once again, we've struck it rich with the timing of our topic and our speaker. The Middle East and Ambassador Dennis Ross, front and center in today's New York Times with a provocative column by Tom Friedman on Netanyahu and what his policies mean. Ambassador Ross's take on Friedman and his prescriptions will be enlightening. After the Robin Wright program that Janice mentioned, we'll host another headline maker, Congressman Adam Schiff, one of our regulars. He'll discuss Congress in 2023 and beyond in dialogue with KCRW's Madeline Brand. The following week, we welcome back David Frum, who is always thoughtful and well-received. His articles in The Atlantic invariably generate thought-provoking discussions, and he'll be interviewed by the LA Times' Pat Morrison. It's now my pleasure to introduce once again Warren Olney, one of our most frequent hosts of America at Crossroads. I stopped counting his hosting stints for us at 29. He's the recipient of numerous awards for broadcast excellence, including Emmys, Golden Mics, and perhaps most noteworthy, the Lifetime Achievement Award presented by his colleagues in the news business. It should be an illuminating discussion. Warren?
Thank you, David, very much. Ambassador David Ross, as you mentioned, Dennis Ross, I beg your pardon, is a distinguished fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. He was America's point man in the Israeli-Palestinian peace process for Presidents George H.W. Bush and Bill Clinton. He helped to shape the Oslo Accords of 1995. Later on, he was special assistant for the Middle East to President Barack Obama and Secretary of State Hillary Clinton. Earlier, as director of the State Department planning staff during the Reagan years, he played a role in U.S. policy toward the Soviet Union. Ambassador Ross holds a Presidential Medal for Distinguished Federal Service and the State Department's highest awards. He is a widely published author. He has written many books and articles. And Mr. Ambassador, it is my privilege once again to welcome you to America at a Crossroads.
Warren, it's always good to be with you. Thank you.
Our subject today is the return of Netanyahu, his latest incarnation as Prime Minister of Israel. And I'm particularly interested in the fact, as you said, as we were setting up for the program a moment ago, that you had just been in Israel. So you're particularly well prepared at the moment to comment on what's going on now. This right-wing coalition that was formed late last year is very different from governments of the past, even governments led by Mr. Netanyahu. And this past weekend, perhaps you were there, 80,000 people turned out in the rain to protest against proposals that haven't even been acted on yet. So I'm wondering, is that a signal that there is trouble ahead in Israel?
Well, there certainly is an emotionally charged environment in Israel. In fact, when I say that, one might feel, well, gee, isn't there always an emotionally charged environment in Israel? And the answer is no. It is a politically dynamic, extremely vibrant, always the scene of great debates. But I've never seen the political debate as politically emotionally charged as it is right now. And there is a sense that democracy itself is at stake on the part of those who were in the streets. You said 80,000. In fact, the numbers were probably over 100,000, and it was in pouring rain. The idea that people would come out in pouring rain is really a testament to how strongly they feel about what they see. What's interesting is there is this dichotomy, there is this divide. There are those in Israel who voted for this government, and this is a very divided society right now. And those who voted for this government, basically, they voted primarily because of personal security issues, which we can talk more about. But they also, one of the issues, to be fair, Prime Minister Netanyahu and those who were in different parties were emphasizing that there was an imbalance among the institutions, and that the judiciary and the Supreme Court had acquired too much power, was frustrating the will of the majority. And we have an indication of that from their standpoint today, because the Supreme Court voted by 10-1 to make it clear that Aryeh Deri, who is the head of the Shas party, who is going to be the Minister of Health and also the Minister of Interior, who's going to carry two ministerial portfolios, they mandated that because he had made a plea deal over a tax evasion issue, a plea deal that he concluded exactly a year ago, in which he said he would resign, and he did at the time, from the Knesset, and he left the impression he was promising to stay out of politics. 10 of the 11 justices came in and said he cannot serve, basically because he lied to the court. He left the impression he was done with politics. Now, his party, the Shas party, is an Orthodox religious party, and members in his party, senior members, were already saying before the Supreme Court made its ruling that if the prime minister acted on that ruling, they would pull out of the government. Now, since the ruling was this afternoon in Israel, Deri himself has said, well, a door is closed, but we'll come through a window. There's a question of, will the prime minister abide by the decision of the Supreme Court, or will he defy it? This afternoon, again, before he said anything, there are many people who are connected to him in Likud were saying he would not defy the Supreme Court. Now, something has to give. Either he defies the Supreme Court and keeps Deri as a minister, or the Shas party doesn't live up to its promise to withdraw from the government. Were they to withdraw from the government would collapse. I don't believe they will withdraw from the government. I think Deri's comment that when a door is closed, we'll find a window, that suggests they will come up with some kind of solution to try to work this out. But it is an indication of how, I would say, uncertain in some respects the political situation is, and how volatile it is likely to be.
Well, if there's already the possibility that the Shas party might, in fact, withdraw from the coalition, how stable is it?
Well, obviously, I think when you have a government that has been put together where any one party that withdraws from it, that suggests two things to you. One, each party, no matter its size, has enormous leverage because the government doesn't exist without them. And two, unless you satisfy them, there's a real risk that they could pull out. Now, the Shas party, as I said, I don't believe the threat for them to pull out is one they're prepared to act on. And there's an additional reason for it. They are a religious party, and when they're in the government, they get budgets for their yeshiva, which is among the most important objectives that they have. They were outside the government for 18 months, and their schools, their yeshivas suffered as a result. So I think they will, notwithstanding the threat to pull out, I'm not sure that's a threat they will actually act on.
You mentioned the Supreme Court, and over the weekend, as I understand it, the main reason for the protests was that there has been an agreement to weaken the Supreme Court, and it has been claimed that that part of the agreement has in fact, or was in fact designed to get Netanyahu off the hook. He is on trial for bribery and fraud and breach of trust. Do you think that that was what he agreed to in order to, or that was why he agreed to all of this? And if so, what did he get in response?
His Yariv Levin, who is the Minister of Justice that he appointed, suggested that the imbalance among the institutions and the undue weight that the Supreme Court had acquired was obviously the reason for the reforms that he has authored. He said yesterday that the three indictments were a contributing factor for the legislation, justifying this proposed legislation on the grounds that the indictments themselves were already assigned, that there was an imbalance, things were out of balance between the different institutions. Is it what motivated the prime minister? You know, is it a factor? Obviously, there's a lot of people in Israel who believe that it's a factor. He says that it's not. It is interesting and perhaps ironic that his justice minister has just created a connection between the two. I think it is worth trying to explain what are the provisions of what Levin has proposed to be instituted as law. Already, just so you know, they have a constitution, even though Israel doesn't have a constitution, they have a committee in the Knesset called the Constitution, Law, and Justice Committee. And hearings on his proposed legislation began this week, and they will go on for several weeks. There are four basic provisions that he has authored. One would increase the political input into the selection of the Supreme Court justices. There is a committee of 9 that has been dominated historically by the Israeli Lawyers Association, the equivalent of the ABA here. Over the last several years, the last justice minister, Ayelet Shaked, she was herself feeling that the justices were too oriented towards the left side of the political spectrum. So she worked to try to change the political balance within. And there are at least 3 judges now who are seen as conservative judges. By the way, all of them today voted against Derry being a minister. These 3 justices are people who have made consistent positions that reflected being much more on the conservative side of the spectrum. But so the first provision was create, out of this committee of 9, have 6 of the 9 be political people, only one of whom would be from the opposition. So the purpose here was to clearly politicize the selection of the judges. I would just say parenthetically, it's hard to say that's an anti-democratic move when most democratic countries, including our own, in fact, do have political criteria, or at least have a political selection process. The second provision is one that would ensure that all the legal advisors in the ministries would no longer be appointed by the Attorney General, who is supposed to be a nonpartisan figure. And these legal advisors in the ministries would no longer answer to the Attorney General, but would answer to the ministers within those ministries. That too is something that would seem quite familiar to those of us here in this country, because I served for many years in the State Department. I can tell you that every legal advisor in the State Department was appointed by the Secretary of State. You change the administration, you change Secretary of State. So here again, I don't find that an anti-democratic move. But it's in Israel, it's seen as politicizing something that hadn't been politicized before. The third provision is that Israel doesn't have a constitution, but it has a basic law. It has a number of basic laws, but the most important basic law was adopted in the early 1990s, and it calls for the dignity and rights of the individual. And Supreme Court justices evaluate legislation frequently against this basic law. And Aharon Barak, who was the longtime president of the Supreme Court, who came out strongly in interviews, not this past weekend, but the weekend before, against the Levin quote legal reforms, he defined a standard of reasonableness as it related to the basic law. And what these provisions would do away with that standard of reasonableness, remove that as a basis on which the court would be justifying things. It's hard to draw a comparison because we don't really have a comparison. We have a constitution, Israel doesn't. So this one, it's a little harder to make a judgment about it. But the fourth item is clearly an anti-democratic move because it would allow the Knesset to override the Supreme Court with a bare majority of 61. 120 members of the Knesset, 61 could mean a very narrow-based government, meaning a government with effectively a majority of one, because you switch one seat and you lose your majority. They could basically go ahead and override any Supreme Court decision. That's majoritarian rule. Democracies are based on majority rule, respect for minority rights. That would do away with that. And that's the one, I think, more than the other, even though the others are seen as part of this larger package, this is the one that creates the most emotional response by Israelis and has them emphasizing that this is really a struggle over Israel's future identity as a democracy. Warren, you've gone mute. You have to unmute yourself, yeah.
I somehow got muted. I don't know how that happened. Would that somehow give the court or give the Knesset the opportunity to overrule the court if it made a judgment against Netanyahu in the bribery, fraud, and breach of contract cases?
It's it's an interesting question, and it's not clear that it would apply to that, although in theory it could. I think there are a variety of different possibilities that would end the trial. One would be if they revised the legal code. That's not part of this initial set of reforms, but there certainly is talk that may be a subsequent reform. If you revise the legal code and one proposal was to drop fraud and breach of trust as indictable offenses, then the legal code changes immediately. So that was one possibility. A second possibility is that you could change the Attorney General, or you could split the function of the Attorney General. Today, there's an Attorney General who is both Chief Prosecutor, but also the Chief Law Enforcement Manager of the government. So if you split the function and said, okay, you're going to have a prosecutor now, and the current Attorney General will retain basically the role of giving legal advice to the government, and the new prosecutor could decide, look, I want to look at the trial. I'm not sure I want to pursue the trial because I think I look at there have been errors along the way of the prosecution. That would be a second possibility. So I'm raising these because it might not be the override provision that would be the issue that would deal with the trial. But there are these other possibilities too that I've already mentioned. There's a third one that is known as kind of the French law. The French president cannot be indicted or stand trial so long as that person is president. And there is a move to pass that as legislation. And again, the legislation can be adopted with a majority of one. So that might be less controversial than dealing with the larger questions of fundamentally changing the role of the Supreme Court and the weight of the Supreme Court. You can talk about politicizing the Supreme Court, but if you neuter the Supreme Court, where you basically make it clear that it is not an equal branch of government, that it cannot overrule what the Knesset does, then you've really done away with separation of powers. And it's possible that you can take these other steps that could deal with the trial without fundamentally altering what is the weight of the Supreme Court and preserving separation of powers in Israel.
How much is publicly known about the evidence against Netanyahu for bribery and fraud and breach of trust? My understanding of those charges is that they're the kinds of charges you can argue about.
I think that's a very fair way to describe it. Again, when I was just in Israel, not only this time, there are people on both sides of this issue, including some people who are not on the right, some people who, by the way, don't even support this coalition, who raise questions about how good the evidence is. And the prosecution has apparently made a number of mistakes in the course of the trial. And in some cases, some evidence has been disqualified by the judges. So I think it's, for some, it's an open and shut case. And for others, it's something that is kind of prosecutorial overreach. The thing is, however, that there are those who say, okay, look, but you have a trial and you ought to let it play out and see what the judges will do. There's no jury here. This is being tried in a district court in Jerusalem, and there are 3 judges, and the 3 judges will define the outcome. But I think your characterization of it is very fair. I think for many people, this is not an open and shut case.
You mentioned one of the parties in the coalition. Another is the RZP, the Religious Zionist Party, which I understand to be nationalistic, very orthodox, and it has very, very powerful positions in the new coalition, including authority over the police and the defense forces as well. What does that mean for the Palestinians, the Israeli Arabs, and the occupied territories?
Well, you're talking about two different leaders,
okay,
who came together, Itamar Ben-Gvir and Bezalel Smotrich.
Okay.
Ben-Gvir has been made Minister for National Security. They changed the title of the ministry, which previously was the Ministry of Public Security. Now it's National Security. And he's also been given responsibility over the border police who operate in the West Bank. The military, the outgoing chief of staff of the military, Aviv Kohavi, before the new government was installed, went to Netanyahu and emphasized, you can't divide command and control. The border police operate in the West Bank, and any operations, it's the military that determines how they operate. What apparently has been decided is on any military operation, the border police will still answer to the chief of staff of the military and to the head of central command in the West Bank. I will tell you from my conversations there with people in the military, they were confident that when it came to operational issues, they would manage and there would not be a confusion of the lines of authority. But you've probably heard of price tag attacks. These are settlers who decide that they will go on a rampage. If there's an act of violence by Palestinians, they will go carry out what they call price tag attacks. They will impose their own price on Palestinians. And what I did hear from a number of people in the military were concerns about if Ben-Gvir has responsibility for the border police, will they act against those who are lawless or carry out acts of violence against Palestinians? And that's a genuine concern, because if they don't, you're just adding a lot of fuel to a fire. Already the tensions within the West Bank are quite high, even though 160,000 Palestinians a day work in Israel from the West Bank. The 1/3 of the GDP of the Palestinians, of the Palestinian Authority, comes from Palestinians who work in the West Bank or who work in Israel or in settlements. This is not what we've seen in terms, there's been an increase in violence, been 155 Palestinians who basically have been killed since March of last year, about 30 Israelis. So there's a level of violence that is dramatically higher than it's been for years. But the public is not joining in. The Palestinian public is not joining in with that. These are basically 18 to 26-year-olds. It is noteworthy. I said 160,000 a day work in Israel. You have to be 27 or older to be able to work in Israel as a Palestinian. Most of those responsible for carrying out the violence, I would say more than 95%, it's not 100%, but more than 95% are in that 18 to 26-year-old time frame or time age. Many of them have gone to college. Almost all are unemployed. They are very frustrated and angry over the level and depth of corruption in the Palestinian Authority, deeply alienated from the Palestinian Authority, frustrated by the fact that there is no political horizon there. And it's a combustible mixture. Now, the Israelis wanted the Palestinian security forces to deal in places like Jenin. These are northern cities in the West Bank, Jenin and Nablus. And they basically stopped acting there. So it's the Israelis who go in every night when they pick up intelligence of those who are planning or basically planning attacks against Israelis. The problem is, and the Israeli security forces will be the first to admit it, they do it because they don't have a choice, because if they don't do it, there's likely to be dead Israelis. But every time they do it, they weaken the PA further, the Palestinian Authority further. So it's a dilemma. They go into arrest. They don't go into kill, they go into arrest, but there is resistance. Every time there's resistance, they end up killing the people they go into arrest. And oftentimes there are bystanders who are not part of, who are not part of any group or not part of those who are responsible for terror, who also end up being killed. So we have a very combustible mixture right now. Something has to change on the Palestinian side to remake and create governance again. And the Israelis have to figure out, how do you try to manage this without adding to the problem? It's a real dilemma, and it's not something that you can easily say, gee, to Israel, you should just stop. Well, if you just stop, then you're gonna have dead Israelis. And no one who is responsible for security would be living up to that responsibility if they did nothing. But it's a genuine dilemma.
At the outset, David mentioned Tom Friedman's column today in the New York Times, where he says that the new government is hostile to America's interests and values, especially when it comes to the Palestinians. You know as much as anybody about America's relationship to Israel, and I'm wondering, should the Biden administration, do you think, take some kind of, I guess it would be action in advance of some sort, to deal with the kinds of issues that Tom Friedman is talking about?
Look, I always like to take a step back and sort of say, all right, what are the choices we have here? On the one hand, it is true. If you look at what has been a fundamental pillar of the U.S.-Israeli relationship, shared values. Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East. Shared values have always been the glue that has bound this relationship. So it is important to emphasize shared values and not dismiss them. I would say that the Biden administration needs to make that point, and I think the president will. But I also think there's, again,
excuse me, in what respect, which values are potentially being compromised? What should he specifically, what points should Biden make?
Well, look, I think there's two that would stand out. One is the U.S. has consistently defends the Israelis in all international forum. International forum, by the way, are completely imbalanced when it comes to Israel. Israel is dealt with in a way that nobody else has dealt with. Yeah. You look at the Human Rights Council that is filled with people who are human rights abusers, 70% of all the resolutions are about Israel and no one else. So this is a completely distorted, unbalanced, biased approach internationally. We, the US, have stood by the Israelis, and especially when it comes to efforts by the International Criminal Court or the ICJ to fight against the Israelis in the West Bank. Now, we have a very strong basis on which to resist them legally, because the Israeli position has been that the occupation is a temporary reality. It's a military occupation, it's a temporary reality, and the aim is to resolve this through a negotiation. And this gets back to your earlier question. What Ben Gvir and Smotrich want to do is they effectively want to end the military occupation as such and have it run as a civil reality, and they take away the reality. This is a temporary occupation, and they make it permanent because in a sense that's what they want. That we didn't emphasize. Look, when it comes to protecting you on the world stage or doing everything we can to do so, you can't undercut the main legal argument we have. So here's a case of shared values and a legal argument as well. The second element is, again, on separation of powers. You can't be a democracy if suddenly you no longer have separation of powers. So this is a point that I think we have to make. But I would, I'm a practitioner. I may be someone who thinks a lot about these things from a conceptual idea standpoint, but I'm also a practitioner. And I understand that in Prime Minister Netanyahu's case, there is no issue that has motivated him more, that guides him more, that makes him feel that he has a historic responsibility than Iran and the threat that Iran and the Iranian nuclear program poses to Israel. Now, from the standpoint of the administration, you have a built-in ability to focus on addressing something that's very important to him, but also saying a strategy that is going to be effective against Iran not only requires us having a credible threat that the Iranians will believe in, but also because the Iranians don't see themselves as North Korea, isolation is a critical part of any strategy that's going to be successful. Now, if Ben-Gvir and Smotrich set the West Bank on fire, or Ben-Gvir and Smotrich transform this conflict in a way that sort of is designed to say there are no Palestinian rights, you're going to end up making Israel the issue. We want the focus to be on Iran. So you cannot allow your government or those people in it to suddenly create a distraction. One of the ways to, I think, ensure that the prime minister will control Ben-Gvir and Smotrich is to focus on strategic imperatives that are his strategic imperatives. Number one is Iran, and he needs it. We need to be together on that. One way to do that is to ensure that he makes certain moves as it relates to the Palestinians, and he prevents certain moves of the sort I was getting at with Smotrich and Ben-Gvir. Second strategic imperative for him is Saudi Arabia. He wants to produce a historic breakthrough with the Saudis, and there is a potential for that. But once again, while the Saudis, I will tell you, as someone who's I make 2 trips there a year, I'm going again in a month, they really don't have how shall I put this diplomatically? The Palestinians are not a priority for them. But that doesn't mean they can be completely indifferent. Ben-Gvir, 3 days into the new government, goes up to the Temple Mount just to make a statement. This is the one issue that can set the whole Middle East on fire. When the Trump administration moved the embassy, there was no reaction because it didn't touch the religious issue. The one thing that is not just emotive, but is electric, is if you touch the Al-Aqsa Mosque, you touch the Dome of the Rock. The Israelis call this the Temple Mount. The Arabs call it the Haram al-Sharif. You touch the Temple Mount, you touch the Haram, and you set things in motion you cannot control. Here again, if in fact there's going to be a breakthrough with the Saudis, you cannot take steps as it relates to the Temple Mount that may produce that kind of a backlash. Again, or if everything explodes with the Palestinians, again, you create a psychological climate in which even if MBS and the Saudi leadership wants to have a breakthrough with the Israelis, they will find it very difficult to do so. So here again, you have 2 strategic imperatives that are the issues that are most important to this prime minister. And if you can say, you're jeopardizing what is most important strategically from your standpoint and from Israel's standpoint and its future. And it cannot be that you're going to allow these guys to go, as an example, go legalize all the unauthorized outposts. In 2004, Arik Sharon promised George W. Bush that he would dismantle all the unauthorized outposts. Well, there's 102 of them, and that wasn't done. It's a big difference between not carrying out a commitment and actually reversing it. And in the coalition agreement there is a statement about going ahead and legalizing all the outposts. Now, there is a provision in the coalition agreement that it's up to the prime minister. Prime minister has the final word. But here's an example of taking a step that undercuts, as I said, this notion that this is a temporary occupation. This is something that I think also, it doesn't just undercut shared values. It's something that I think kind of precludes for the administration. This is a president who says we remain committed to a two-state solution. Well, you go ahead and you do that, you're basically preempting that. You know, it's one thing not to be out there supporting a two-state solution. It's something else to preclude it as a possibility.
We talked about Tom Friedman's column today. Yossi Klein Halevi, who's another well-known commentator, I think, on all of this, from Israel itself, of course, an authoritative voice from the center, I guess you could say,
Yes.
in Israel. He says the new government is the most politically extreme, morally corrupt, and contemptuous of good governance in Israel's history. He says it risks tearing apart the relationship between Israel and the Jewish diaspora. Are you worried about a decline in American support for Israel, particularly among American Jews, if in fact the Netanyahu administration is as bad as he says it is?
Well, I think what it highlights is some of what I was getting at before. You look at the religious Zionist party who you're referring to before, and I referred to its two leaders. You look at the Haredi parties, and there are a number of steps that they want to take. There are those who want to revise the law of return. Well, obviously that affects the diaspora. They are undoing what was the compromise that existed on women being able to pray at the wall. There was a specific area to the south of where what's known as the Wailing Wall is, where women could go and pray, and that they want to reverse. The whole approach of the religious in this government at this point, it creates enormous potential for further alienating Jews in the diaspora. I mean, one of the critical things to think about is that Israel is the state of the Jewish people. And in fact, every government refers to itself as the state of the Jewish people. When you say the state of the Jewish people, you mean the state of the whole Jewish people. You're not saying this is just the state of the Orthodox. Yeah, you can't excommunicate the Reform and Conservative who make up the lion's share of the Jewish diaspora. So I am concerned that, again, just that if some of the more extreme moves that are being pushed, and here we're not talking about the Palestinians, you're talking about the approach in terms of issues that relate specifically to the pluralism of the Jewish people. The Jewish people are pluralistic, and suddenly, if you're trying to preclude that pluralism, you're going to have a problem. And so I think here again, you have a prime minister who, you know, he's now 73. He's certainly, he's Israel, put it this way, he's Israel's longest serving prime minister, longer than Ben-Gurion. If he wants a legacy, the legacy can't be that he created great division with the diaspora, and he precluded being able to build on his own achievements like the Abraham Accords. So that's why I say, I mean, what you're really dealing with, and I have to say, one of the most interesting things I heard in Israel, there were those I talked to who said, Prime Minister Netanyahu thinks he can control this government and Ben-Gvir and Smotrich, but he can't. And others who said he can and he will. Now, I would say, you know, he's proven himself to be a master politician with no equal in Israel. So I think it's a mistake to underestimate what he can do, but I think the challenges are real and he has to make some hard choices. And it gets back to one of the first questions you asked, Warren, about how stable is the government. There is a built-in tension here between the kind of strategic imperatives he wants to achieve, the kind of of, I think, comfort level he wants within the diaspora and what elements of his government want to do. And he has to be able to reconcile that. And there will come a point where it may be very difficult to reconcile that, in which case I could certainly envision a scenario where he seeks to broaden the government and bring in what is a center, the party like the National Unity Party. They wouldn't be against it, but I think they, here's where the trial comes back into play. They don't want to be a party to looking like they contributed to somehow allowing the trial to go away. Now, if the trial went away, then it becomes a different story. But for me, I think the thing to watch is, how does the prime minister manage the built-in tension between his strategic objectives and the strategic priorities of some of those within his government?
I could go on for a very long time asking you questions. This is really exciting for me and a real opportunity to be with you, but I want to give other people an opportunity. I forgot to mention at the outset that roughly at this time in the interview, what we do is go to listener questions, or viewer questions, I should say, which are transmitted to me by David Lair, and I do have some on my iPhone, even though I forgot to mention it at the outset. So let me give those folks a chance now and start with Alan, who wants to know, is the two-state solution effectively dead?
It is certainly on life support. The question is, what can be done to preserve it? And here I would say this is not an Israeli-only problem. Look, the Palestinians are completely divided between the West Bank and Gaza, between Fatah and the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank and Hamas in Gaza. Hamas is getting money from Iran and is fomenting as much chaos as it can within the West Bank because it seeks to take it over. And Hamas rejects the idea of two states. The Palestinian Authority is so weak, it couldn't negotiate anything, and therefore it sticks with broad slogans. So on the one hand, there isn't a political basis on the Palestinians to be able to negotiate it. And on the other, we have an Israeli government right now that obviously doesn't favor it. So the issue is not, is this something we can address at this point? And it's a legitimate question to ask, as you are. The question for me is, how do you preserve it? Because when, one state is completely unrealistic unless you favor a perpetual conflict. These are two national movements competing for the same space, two very strong national identities. We're not in an era of post-nationalism anywhere in the world, and we're certainly not in an era of post-nationalism within the Middle East. There is no state in the Middle East where there is more than one national, tribal, or sectarian identity that is at peace. So you put together one state where you have the Israelis and the Palestinians, it'll be perpetual conflict. So that can't be the answer. The answer can't be one state where the Israelis dominate everything. The answer can't be one state where the Palestinians basically try to use their numbers over time to dominate everything. There's one of my friends of long standing among Fatah is a guy named Ahmed Ghanem. He was, at one time he was part of what was the Young Fatah movement. It reminds me of, the Komsomol was once known as the Young Communist Movement in the Soviet Union, and the leader of the Komsomol was 60 years old. So the Komsomol lost its youth, and the same with a lot of the young Fatah people like Ahmed Ghanem. But he once said, look, in one state, either they will try to dominate us or we will try to dominate them. So that can't be the answer. So right now, given the gaps, given the lack of political capability on either side to negotiate a two-state outcome, we need to focus on how you preserve it as an option. And for me, I think, one, you avoid the unilateral steps that the Israelis would take, but two, we have to make much more of a determined effort to get reform and institution building on the Palestinian side. If you had a Palestinian state tomorrow, it would be a failed state. We don't need one more failed state in the Middle East. We need to build from the ground up there. We need to focus on that. We need to use all the donors to use their leverage to get Abu Mazen to appoint an empowered prime minister who will carry out reforms, build institutions, build the rule of law. That's what we need to do as a way of preserving the option. We don't want the option to die because you don't have alternatives to it. But if we're not going to have it die, then both sides, there has to be actions on both sides to help preserve it.
Dan wants to know, what is the likelihood that Netanyahu might take military action against Iran and its nuclear program?
I think it depends on whether he can come to an understanding with President Biden on how we collectively will restore deterrence. Look, right now, the Iranians are acting as if they have nothing to fear. They have 16 cascades. Cascades are 164 centrifuges in a cascade. You bring them together, they can produce much more fissile material than if they're each separate. So you have 16 of these producing, using very advanced centrifuges that are dramatically more efficient than the original centrifuges that did enrichment. So they have 16 of these using their advanced centrifuges, enriching to 60%. 60% has no justifiable civilian purpose. It is extremely close to weapons grade. It takes almost no time. They could go from 60% to 90% in 7 to 10 days. 90% is weapons grade. So they have a breakout time to weapons grade fissile material of essentially zero. If nothing changes by the end of this year, they'll have 10 bombs worth, at least 10 bombs worth of enriched material to that amount. You know, it's true they haven't created weaponization yet, but we can't know where they are in weaponization the same way we can know on enrichment. So Netanyahu is going to come here and he's going to say the path they're on is going to produce a weapon sooner or later, even if you, Mr. President, say they won't get it on your watch. They don't have a fear. We have to restore that fear. We have to convince them how much they have to lose if they keep going down this road. If Netanyahu is convinced that we have a common approach on this, he won't act militarily. But if he's convinced that we are not going to do more and that simply they're on a pathway where they're going to get it, he will act. He will act militarily. He views this as an existential threat to Israel. And if he feels that we're not going to act, he's going to convey to the president that the Israelis will. So I think a lot depends on whether or not they can reach an understanding on this. I don't think it's impossible. And I also don't think it's impossible to deter the Iranians from continuing down this path, but they have to fear that they will lose their entire nuclear infrastructure. They have spent 40 years investing in this at enormous expense to them at a time when they have tremendous economic problems. It tells you a lot about how important it is to have this at least as an option. They need to know that it can all be destroyed if they continue down this path. And if you look at their behavior over time, they have been deterrable. Just one example, back in 2012, Netanyahu went to the UN and he laid out what his red line was. They could not enrich above 20%. And for a long time, they did not do that. They respected that. There are limits they will respect when they believe the limits are real. And so I think the key here is how do we reestablish a kind of deterrence of them, which I think over the last couple of years has clearly diminished.
Barbara wants to know, what is Israel's relationship with Ukraine? And I would add to that I saw a report recently that it may be the United States wants to take weaponry that's in Israel and give it to Ukraine, particularly because of what's happening in the peninsula where which Russia has illegally occupied. How do you respond to that whole situation?
Yeah, look, it's Israel has been very careful during this conflict because the Russians established a presence in Syria on their northern border. They have S-400 defense. These are surface-to-air missiles that are quite effective. Israel is dealing with Iran that is embedding itself within Syria. They have a precision-guided project, which is to put precision guidance on the tens of thousands of missiles and rockets that they have provided to Hezbollah in Lebanon. They transit this through Syria, and the Israelis continually attack it. The Russians have given the Israelis a kind of freedom of action to do that, to blunt these threats. the Israeli fear is if suddenly they start providing advanced weaponry to Ukraine, the Russians will start turning on their air defense radars. They will dramatically raise the cost of the Israelis. Israelis don't want to get into a shootout with the Russians, and so they've been careful. Now, so that said, they have given non-lethal equipment. They've built a field hospital there on the ground. They have given increasing help on early warning for defense. They will not provide Iron Dome to the Ukrainians because of the threats they face themselves. They don't have enough to be able to contend with the potential threats that they could face from Hezbollah and from Hamas, from north and the south. But there are other things that they can provide. And Warren, what you were referring to is way back in one of my earlier incarnations in the Pentagon, I helped to work and devise the idea that for power projection purposes in the Middle East, we would pre-stock equipment in Israel. It would be highly secure, and it means all you have to do is fly people in and marry up with the equipment so you're able to project power from much more significant power very quickly. Now, the provision was, okay, we will pre-stock it there for our use, but in an emergency, the Israelis would have access to it. What we are now asking the Israelis to do, and apparently they've agreed, is that we want to draw on some of those stocks that exist there. What is our problem right now? The Ukrainians, given the nature of the war, are expending ammunition and munitions at a very high rate. We can't produce it fast enough. And the Europeans are the same. But there's a lot of artillery, a lot of munitions for artillery that are pre-stocked in two places. One is in Israel, the other's in South Korea. And so we want to draw on that to help meet Ukrainian needs. And I think here is something where you see there also something else. If the Israelis don't want to provide directly to Ukraine so they have a position they can defend with the Russians, they can provide material to others that frees them up to then provide more to the Ukrainians. And that is something else that I think the Israelis are open to. But that's the backdrop to this is that there's a view that the Israelis in the administration that while there's an understanding that it's complicated for the Israelis because of the Russian presence in Syria and what the Israelis need to be able to do, there is also a sense that Israel has the means to do more, and the administration has wanted to see them do more. And I've just cited two areas where I think we're going to see them do more.
Several questioners have asked this question, and in fact, I got this question from a friend in Chicago before we even began, and it is this. How can American Jews who disagree with Netanyahu express their support for the country, but not for the prime minister?
Look, I think in some ways, it's actually quite easy to do that. You got 100,000 Israelis who turn out in the rain. You have a very active opposition now. One of the ways you can be supportive of Israel is to acknowledge, all right, this is a country that just had its fifth election in 3.5 years, and 71% of the Israeli public turned out to vote. To say this is a vibrant democracy is an understatement. There is a determination on the part of those who feel that there's enormous riding on what's happening right now in Israel. These are Israelis. And it's, the 100,000 is the beginning of what is a kind of movement. So one of the things you can do is identify with them. You can support them. There are groups there that probably can use different kinds of support, including financial. You can be a very strong supporter of Israel. You can recognize it is a vibrant democracy, and you can identify with those who have the same attitudes that you have. And by the way, it's not just the political side. It also deals with those. In Israel, there's a Masorti movement. The Masorti movement combines in Israel the conservative and reform movements. And maybe 10% of the Israeli population follow the Masorti movement. So there are political, religious, and social movements within Israel that reflect, again, this is a highly pluralistic society, just like the Jewish community is a pluralistic community. And you can identify with those who reflect your values.
Can you name some of those groups that people could support?
Well, I can start just with the Masorti movement is a good example, because the Masorti movement promotes pluralism, religious pluralism within Israel. And as I said, 10% of Israelis already are sort of part of it. But here's something that deals very much with the question of preserving religious pluralism within Israel. Politically, you have the different parties that you can be supportive of. So you have, most of the opposition at this point, the opposition parties, whether it's the National Unity Party, I'm moving because my battery is low. Whether you have the National Unity Party, or you have the Labor Party. I mean, you can look at the makeup of the opposition, and then again, you can find, if you have these attitudes and you want to support them, you clearly can do so. Look, there are those within this country, by the way, who think that what's happening in Israel is something that they favor. Okay, so they can support the government. In the Jewish community here, you have a lot of diversity. Well, why not connect with those with whom you identify with in Israel? I think that's the way that's how I would address the issue, Warren.
You said earlier that Netanyahu is a political master, but Mark wants to know, are there any moderate or left of center politically viable candidates to challenge him and with the possibility of succeeding?
Well, we just had an election. And so you had Yair Lapid, and Yesh Atid is his party, and they are the second biggest party in Israel. Benny Gantz heads the National Unity Party, and they're the fourth largest party in Israel. And I think they have, these two parties together represent a significant bloc, or potentially a significant bloc. The election demonstrated more than anything else how divided the country is. Had the Meretz party crossed the threshold, and it fell just short. You need 3.25% to cross the election threshold, the electoral threshold. They came in at 3.1%. All those votes were lost. That shifted the whole frame. If they crossed the threshold, you would have ended up 60-60, not 64-56. So, there's a little bit, it's not quite the same, because they didn't come in. Initially, it looked like the anti-Bibi bloc looked like came in with more votes, but they had two parties that fell just short. In the end, it turned out that wasn't the case, that there was a slight plurality for the bloc that put together the government in the end. But the fact is, you had almost an evenly split country, and the difference was that you didn't have any of the right-wing parties fall short, and you had two left-wing. You had the Meretz party, which is a left-wing party. It fell just short, and you had Balad, which is an anti-Zionist party, an Arab party, that also fell just short. This election, the outcome would have been different if they had each met the threshold. So let
me just interrupt you at that moment, because we only have about a moment left, and I want to give you an opportunity to say anything you want to this audience. This is large and listening very closely.
And look, I would just say, what's going on in Israel is a sign, ironically, that democracy is alive and well. Now, it may go. In the end, those who are in opposition to what's happening, maybe they will lose out for now. But I do think some of the posture that's being adopted is really outside what the mainstream is. Just one thing I didn't mention before, but I'll mention it now. Polling shows today, those 64, if there was an election today, that 64 would be 58. Because a lot of people who voted, this is not what they had in mind. So elections, can create accountability. And if in the end, what we see is that too many steps are being taken that are just too far outside the mainstream, in the end, we'll see another election. Warren, the very first question you asked is, how stable is this government? And I suggested there is a built-in tension between strategic objectives of the prime minister and the strategic priorities of the religious Zionist party. And, as Prime Minister Netanyahu is a master, but he's going to have to make some hard choices if he's going to ensure that this government is a sustainable one.
Wow, we could not have a greater authority on these issues, and every question is better than turning to to Google or the encyclopedia. We're just delighted to have you once again. Great privilege on my part to be able to talk to you, and thank you so much, Ambassador Dennis Ross.
Warren, it's always a pleasure to be with you. Thank you.
On January 25th next week, Vladimir Putin's future is going to be the subject of experts on the Kremlin and Putin as well, or an expert, excuse me, Ambassador Michael McFaul, ambassador of Russia under President Obama, head of the Russian desk at the National Security Council. He'll be in conversation with my good friend KPCC's Larry Mantle. That'll be next Wednesday at 5 o'clock. Meantime, thank you all for watching, listening. It's great to be with you, and thanks again for America at a Crossroads.